Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling time, the very nature of time. Does it really flow in one direction, or is that just our perception? We've got some source material that's taking aim at a pretty common idea, which is that the laws of physics don't actually distinguish between the past and the future.
Yeah, you've given us a source that's, well, it's not pulling any punches. It calls statements like, the laws of physics don't have a built-in direction of time. Complete nonsense.
Yeah. It's a bold way to kick things off, for sure. But does this source back up this strong claim?
Well, let's see. The source is arguing that the arrow of time is actually hidden. It's hidden within physics equations, particularly in how we calculate the change in time.
Okay, how does that work?
So think about how we measure change in time. We always subtract an earlier time from a later one, even though equations can be reversed on paper. In reality, we always calculate this change moving forward.
That's interesting. It's like you can write a recipe and release, but you can't unbake a cake, right?
Precisely. The source is saying that even the most fundamental equations, the ones that describe change, like the ones that govern electron behavior, they rely on this forward-moving difference in time.
So the source is saying the arrow of time isn't missing. It's just disguised within the math that we use.
That's the argument. And it gets even more radical. The source claims that time itself might not actually be a fundamental aspect of reality, but rather a paper concept invented by humans.
Whoa, so like time isn't real.
The source is suggesting that change is the true fundamental reality we just use, the idea of time, to represent that change in a way our brains can understand. We experience the world as this constant flow of events, and time is just our way of organizing that flow.
I guess I never really thought of time as just a tool before, like a ruler to measure change, instead of an actual force.
Now, a lot of physicists point to the second law of thermodynamics. This is the idea that things tend to become more disordered over time as the source of time's arrow.
But our source seems to disagree.
Strongly. They argue that the second law actually needs a direction of time to even exist. It describes how systems change over time, but it doesn't explain why time moves forward.
So if a sandcastle gets destroyed by the tide, that's entropy. Right? Things becoming more disordered. But that relies on the idea that time is moving forward, right?
Exactly. The source is saying that change is what drives the arrow of time, not the other way around. Change is the fundamental reality.
Okay, my brain is already doing backflips. So if change is the fundamental reality, what happens to the idea of cause and effect? Does one thing still lead to another?
This is where it gets really interesting. The source is arguing that causality, much like time, might be more of a mental construct than an inherent property of the universe.
Wait, are you saying that cause and effect might not be as straightforward as we think?
Well, think about how we experience the world. We see a sequence of events, and we automatically connect them as cause and effect. But what if? That's just how our brains organize, this constant flow of change.
Okay, I think I'm following. So dropping a glass causes it to shatter. But the source might say, that's just our way of interpreting the change, from a whole glass to broken pieces.
Precisely. And the source is saying that this has real implications for how we understand the universe, not just philosophical implications.
So it's not just some abstract idea. How does this change-centric view actually play out in physics?
Think of it like watching a movie. You see actions leading to consequences, a clear cause and effect narrative, but if you rewound the movie, the events would happen in reverse. Does that mean time is flowing backward?
Not really. The film is still moving forward. We're just seeing the changes happen in a different order.
Exactly. The order of events. That we see as cause and effect might just be a product of how we experience the flow of change, not an absolute rule of the universe.
Okay, this is blowing my mind. So if we rewound the universe, would everything literally happen in reverse? Would a shattered glass reassemble itself?
That's a question that has puzzled thinkers for ages. Our source doesn't claim to have all the answers, but it definitely encourages us to think outside the box of our usual assumptions.
I'm starting to feel like that box was way too small. This whole deep dive has me rethinking time completely. It's like we zoomed in from clocks and calendars to the very fabric of reality, where change is the main player.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is this perspective isn't coming out of nowhere. It's deeply rooted in the fundamental equations of physics. The source is arguing that. The math itself points toward change being fundamental, even if it doesn't explicitly spell out the arrow of time.
So this idea that change is the real deal, and time is just how we measure it, could have massive implications for how we understand our place in the universe.
Absolutely. It challenges us to rethink everything, from our relationship with the past and future to the very concepts of free will and destiny.
Okay. So we've established that time might be a human construct, and change is the real engine of the universe. But where does that leave us? What are we supposed to do with this information?
That's the million-dollar question. Our source doesn't give us a step-by-step guide, but it leaves us with some profound questions to ponder.
So no easy answers. Come on. Give us something to chew on. What's the key takeaway for our listener?
I think the most valuable takeaway is don't take anything for granted. Even something as seemingly basic as time. Challenge your assumptions, even in areas that seem settled, like physics.
It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that time is this absolute external force, controlling everything.
Right, but if time is really just a framework we've created to make sense of change, that opens up a whole world of possibilities.
Like what? Give us some concrete examples. What could this mean for our listeners' everyday life?
Well, for one thing, it could change how we relate to the past and future. If time is more fluid than we think, maybe dwelling on regrets or anxieties about what might happen is less useful than we believe.
Yeah, that makes sense. If the only constant is change, clinging to fixed ideas about the past or future might not be the best strategy.
Exactly. And if change is the ultimate reality, it could also make us question our ideas about free will versus determinism. Do we have any control over the course of events, or is everything predetermined?
Oh, those are some deep questions. But how does knowing all this change what we should actually do differently?
I think that's where our source leaves us, with the real challenge. They're encouraging us to explore these questions and come to our own conclusions.
So we're ending on a cliffhanger. I feel like our listener deserves a bit more guidance.
Fair enough. Let's circle back to this idea of time potentially being a human construct, if that's true. How does that change your understanding of the world, listener? Does it mean our personal experiences of time are completely subjective?
Is there some universal clock out there? Or is time something we each create in our own minds?
And if it is subjective, could we learn to influence or change our own perception of time?
Okay, now we're getting somewhere. That's a mind-blowing thought, the possibility of actually shaping our experience of time.
Those questions go beyond what our source covers, but they're definitely worth exploring.
Absolutely. So, dear listener, we're leaving you with a challenge. Rethink your relationship with time. Is it a rigid, unbending force or something more malleable?
Is it something you can learn to understand, maybe even influence? The answer, as always, lies within you.
You know, as we've been exploring this idea of time being a construct, I keep coming back to the source's emphasis on change as the real core concept. It's such a simple idea, but it's really shifted my perspective.
It's powerful, isn't it? Everything we experience, from the smallest interactions to the largest events, it all boils down to change happening.
Yeah, it's almost like seeing the world in a new light. Instead of static objects, everything is in motion, constantly evolving, even if we don't always notice it.
This idea of constant change is actually a central theme in a lot of different philosophies. Remember that famous Heraclitus quote, "You can't step in the same river twice"? It really captures the essence of change as the defining feature of reality.
Right. Even though we see things as staying the same over time, at a deeper level, they're constantly changing. It makes me think of that saying, the only constant is change.
And it ties back to our discussion about the arrow of time. If change is always happening, moving from one state to another, then it naturally creates a directionality.
So the source is arguing it's not that time is pushing things forward, but rather the constant process of change itself creates the feeling of time flowing.
Exactly. It's like we've been so focused on the concept of time that we've missed the underlying reality of change driving everything. We've been looking at the map instead of the actual territory.
Okay, so change is the fundamental reality, and time is just our way of conceptualizing it. Does that mean we have any control over our experience of time?
That's a fascinating question. If our perception of time is based on how we experience change, then theoretically anything that alters our experience of change could also alter how we perceive time.
So like how time seems to fly by when you're engrossed in something, but drags on forever when you're bored. Those are everyday examples of our experience of change, warping our sense of time.
Precisely. But could we go even further? Could we deliberately manipulate our perception of time in a more conscious way?
It makes me think about those stories of people in life or death situations where everything seems to slow down for them, or athletes who describe being in the zone, where they react with incredible speed. Because time feels different.
There's actually a lot of interest in how different states of consciousness can influence our experience of time. Practices like meditation are often described as ways to slow down time by focusing intently on the present moment.
It sounds like what the source is suggesting is that maybe we're not completely at the mercy of time. Maybe we have more agency than we realize when it comes to just shaping how we perceive it.
That's definitely a possibility worth exploring. And I think that's what our source is ultimately challenging us to do. Question what we think we know about time, challenge our assumptions, and embrace the mystery of it all.
This whole deep dive has been a real mind bender for me, but it's also been incredibly eye-opening. It's made me realize that even something as seemingly basic as time is full of unanswered questions.
And that's what makes it so fascinating, right? The more we learn, the more we realize how much we still don't know.
Well said. So, dear listener, as we wrap up this deep dive, we leave you with one final thought. If time is truly a construct, a tool we use to understand the ever-changing nature of reality, how will you choose to use it?
Will you let it control you? Or will you strive to become its master? The answer, as always, lies within you.